Welcome back to another episode of In Swine Versation, unraveling the enigma, transitioning from veterinarian to forensic detective in the quest to solve a puzzling swine disease with Dr. Daniel Gascho from Four Star Veterinary Services. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
You've been quite a journey in your career from Indiana, and the goal at a young age from traveling and wanting to be a rural veterinarian. Can you talk about how you achieved this goal?
Yeah, my mom always laughs. She says when people ask her when I decided I wanted to be a veterinarian, she's not sure. She thinks I was born that way. There wasn't, one of those monumental moments where, it occurred to me, I'm going to be that. I grew up in Clinton County, graduated from a little town of Rossville there, north central Indiana. And we didn't necessarily raise pigs ourselves. We had kind of a hobby farm. My brother worked on a commercial swine operation. My uncle had a commercial swine operation. There's pigs everywhere around there. The way I explain it to people is, people know Indiana's a top 5 swine producing state, but what they might not realize is all of the numbers that make it a top 5 state is really concentrated there in those surrounding counties around Logansport and Delphi, the packing plants. And so just surrounded by pigs growing up. Went to Purdue undergrad, partially because it was the local college, but also they had a strong ag background. The College of Agriculture there has really made a name for itself. And then on to Purdue Vet School. I worked in Purdue's research farms. Actually, starting my senior year of high school, I was located there close enough, and then on through undergrad. And from the beginning, I was pretty set on being a traveling vet. I joke I always wanted to be James Harriet, which is obviously not possible in modern times, but I wanted to be out with agriculture and traveling around. And then over time, my background, just how I grew up, I realized I really like swine. And so then started focusing on that. And it's kind of interesting. I ended up close to home, not because I just went back home and searched for a job there. I actually spent time in Iowa and North Carolina and Iowa State and ended up focusing on being a swine veterinarian, and then found Four Star, and then found a clinic, base Four Star that happened to be in north central Indiana. And so I actually chased the career that brought me back to now I'm based out of Delphi, just outside Indiana Packers, and within 20 minutes of where I grew up. So maybe not totally a coincidence, but a backdoor path to get back home.
So it brought you full circle.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's talk about how you were the first and only vet so far to diagnose Strep zoo in the US, which caused an unknown, mysterious high mortality back a few years ago. Why was this not diagnosed before, Daniel?
So a little disclaimer, I've heard there may have been a couple more cases since then, so I don't want to stake claim to the only one forever. I was at the beginning for sure. I was the first one, and all the original ones were me. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing, but there may have been a couple more since then that other vets have some experience with. But on educating myself through that process, we learned that it had been diagnosed in China many years ago with high mortality, and then a few other countries around the globe since. And it hadn't made the news yet because they didn't really know exactly what it was, just like us, but it had actually been in Canada just a couple months prior to our break. And so we didn't know that, but it's working its way closer. And something like that, the reason it wasn't maybe diagnosed is it's hard to diagnose things that you don't know exist. I mean, I don't mean that as a joke, but we don't have PCRs for things we haven't discovered yet. So it was really a process of elimination, and that diagnosis is ruling out everything else until we're left with this, what is this thing? And then going from there.
Were there other species affected, Daniel?
So that's the really unusual thing that I don't know if we have actually the final answer on that yet, because when you say affected, I'll say no. It seems to not cause disease in other species, which is part of why the diagnosis was so difficult, is because you find this bacteria that we've found before in horses and dogs, and that's not something new. And so the question is it new that it made its way into swine and just in the past several years it had never found its way into a pig? Or is it a different variant of that bacteria that's more pathogenic. And so, at least to our knowledge, it doesn't really cause disease in other species. So yeah, it is in other species. It's just more of a, it just exists. So we find it incidentally.
Talk a little bit about the event leading up to this, and also what did you learn?
So to set the stage, this was, I think it's been a little over 5 years ago when ASF, African swine fever, was a really hot topic. Not that it's not now, but it was new on the scene, in China and making waves. And so that's obviously always in the back of everybody's mind. Anytime you get something unexplainable, we're on high alert. And when I got the call that, we had a 50% mortality in a few days, that's just like, that doesn't exist. I mean, first thought is outside of ventilation failure, water deprivation, toxin. I mean, we don't have extreme APPs or PERS or anything that in adult animals causes 50% mortality in that amount of time. And so my initial thought was one of two things: we're missing some obvious mechanical environmental thing, or we have something really major. And again, back to ASF, you don't want to overreact, but that was obviously on your mind at that point as a number one rule out. So
Would you consider this a wake-up call?
uh it's not really a joking matter, but I kind of say tongue in cheek, that better be a wake up call, because if that was our trial run, we kind of failed, to be honest. I mean, we had all the plans or we were trying to. It was new. We obviously had a lot better protocols and things at this point for ASF or any other foreign animal disease. But at that point, it was new enough in our preparation, I'll say, that we couldn't have asked for a much better, not major, I guess I'll say, in the global scheme, trial. And we kind of flunked as far as how we responded. And so hopefully that was a wake-up call that, all the plans we have in place, we don't have them dialed in as like we should. And so we've made a lot of improvements since that point.
You're one of the best vets out there, but now can we call you detective? Well, how explain in this case, how you went from veterinarian to detective?
Well, in vet school, they teach you how to figure things out. It's not really so much just memorization of here's all the things. And luckily for me, it's more of a how to work up a case. Because if you just tried to memorize everything and know what to do for those specific things you memorized, that wouldn't have helped in the slightest in this situation. And so thankfully, I mean, it's kind of cliche, but what they always say is know what you don't know and know how to figure it out when you don't know, because you won't know everything. And so just being able to recognize that it's not something we're familiar with was valuable enough to start the chain of events. What do we do when we have something that isn't the things we know about? And so then sorting through that with diagnostic lab and the government, USDA and investigations and all of that was a valuable experience. Of course, I would never wish the scenario on a client by any means, but it's one of those scenarios that don't come along very often. And so it's very valuable for me just to learn what to do in a scenario like that in case something similar happens in the future. So
Can you talk to us a little bit about your focus on preventative and population medicine and the economics of protein production?
so it's not a real, when I mean, in the veterinary world, we're kind of in our own isolated little chunk, meaning the vast majority of veterinarians deal with companion animals, emotional connection, their dogs, their cats, or any other species. But it's not glamorous, and it's almost like uncomfortable for people to talk about, like, what's the value of an animal? And I'm talking farmers or ag might be more used to that conversation, but general vets, like, I mean, it would be terrible bad side manner to ask, a pet owner, like, what's the value of their pet? We don't have those conversations. And so the economics, the math of protein production is something that is, even if people don't like to talk about it, is necessary for our clients to stay in business. And like with everything, there's a short-term and a long-term perspective. And it may be making difficult decisions in the short term that keep you in business to be able to do good in the long term. And one example I always give that nobody would think twice about is we always say, doing what's best for the animal. Well, overall, or long term versus short term is two different topics. And people are like, well, what do you mean? Well, if you go, I'll just make up a scenario. You go into a nursery and they've got some respiratory disease, and let's, for sake of argument, something we can't diagnose with oral fluids, and there's no fresh mortalities. So what do? We euthanize, a good example of a case to get diagnostics to be able to help the general population. Well, without being sarcastic, I'd argue that's not what was best for that individual animal. But we euthanize one, but we're looking at the bigger picture. And so that perspective carries on to vaccination choices, nutrition choices, all of these things that you have to be able to afford to stay in business to be able to take care of the general population or future pigs. And of course, we're already past the discussion of welfare. These are not like decisions that would impact animal welfare. There's more than one right way to do something. And people tend to feel like it's a false dichotomy. This is better for the pig, and if I don't do it, I'm doing something bad for the pig. And that's not the way it is. There's more than one route to go in the right direction, and it has to pay off. We've got to stay in business to be able to keep raising pigs and take care of those pigs. So sometimes short-term decisions aren't the one that might make sense if you have your blinders on, but bigger picture is the long-term goal to be able to produce more pork.
So your focus is it's not just about the health. So your approach, you want to be a partner for overall operational health, which includes pig health and business, the business part of it. You treat the business like your own, right, Daniel?
Yeah, and when people say, well, it's not all about the health, that sounds bad, to be honest. Nobody wants to say that. What they mean is overall, long term or short term. And the same conversation goes for nutrition. You talk about some amino acid that increases feed efficiency by this much. Well, that sounds good. But if it costs you 3 times more than you're going to make on the back, and we don't do that, even though technically, depending on your definition of animal health, this might have been the right decision for animal health. But you got to look at it long term. I'm going to go out of business. That's not good for those animals' health. And so it's the same topic right on down the line. And so we are on about animal health, but that time frame, that may not be today for this group. That may not even be this year or 5 years, but maybe it's a decision for the sustainability of future generations to be able to raise pigs. And so, I can give examples of, a vaccine that might make this pig healthy, but it's going to cost you more than we have to gain back. Those type of topics are where I guess my title is consultant, because it's not about, in vet school, they talk about prevent the fire or put out the fire. Short term, it's easier to look good on that individual animal by putting out the fire, fix that problem. And maybe that's the same solution as the big picture, but maybe it's not. Maybe we do something to long-term make more money or be sustainable or help more animals that isn't with our blinders right then and there.
I think it's great. It kind of broadens the approach and how you help your customer on an overall level, which leads us into the strategy and philosophy of building authentic relationships. So I know you're a big advocate on building real relationships. What does that mean to you, Daniel?
Well, that whole business strategy that I talked about is arguably, from the veterinarian's perspective, kind of a risky thing to say, we're going to make some choice that isn't the short term as quick, visibly turnaround in health or whatever it might be. And so if you don't have a strong relationship with your clients, meaning they trust you on a personal level to have their best interest in mind and not just look good in the short term, you can look bad. Because in my hypothetical scenario where these pigs are dying and we can make them stop dying with shooting X expensive antibiotic into every pig, but then you go out of business. If I tell them that the best thing for you is to not do that and do this thing for long-term sustainability, they have to understand that if it doesn't look like a miracle worked overnight, they trust the process. And from just a business strategy, they have to understand, and it's the veterinarian's job to communicate, there's this option and there's this option, and that's why we're going to go with this option. And if they don't truly believe you, and somebody else shows up and offers them this option that makes things look way better in the short term, you're going to look bad. And so they have to understand why you make those decisions that are sometimes difficult. And that just goes back to trust.
Has that always been your approach?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, when you're a new grad, you're just getting your feet under you and you're trying to, quote, put out the fires because that's what you come out of vet school. And so I don't think my approach has necessarily changed so much as my role within the, the more consulting versus the short term solve the issues. And so, yeah, I mean, relationships are obviously always important, but it's especially important if you're making decisions that maybe months to years down the road that they understand why, because I don't want their pigs to die in the next week either. And so it goes back to, if they trust you and you've built that credibility, that relationship, then I want to be able to say to them that if I were you and this was my money and I knew all that I knew, whether it's what this disease is going to do, what that drug is going to do, what pig prices are going to be, the odds of African swine fever getting all of those things, then I would do what I'm telling you to do. And you need to be able to believe that, not just make it look good so that they're happy.
Well, it makes sense. You're a vet, a consultant, you create a roadmap for the overall approach for each customer. Now, what does the future of swine veterinary medicine look like, and what should we look out for?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think it's exactly what we were just talking about, in that the future is obviously nobody's getting rich with minimal effort raising pigs. I mean, it's a tough business. There's smaller margins. You have to really be bought into the process. And so the veterinarian's role, at least maybe I'm biased because I'm younger and I plan to be in this career for a while, is sustainability is more that consulting of how do I make sure I have a client for the rest of my career, not just next week they're happy enough to pay their bill. That's not a sustainable business model. And so I think just veterinary medicine, at least swine, and I'll even dial that into commercial swine consulting, because I would tend to lump show pigs and some other things, backyard pet pigs, as closer to companion animals. But in commercial swine, the veterinarian has to be involved for the long haul and be making decisions for their long-term sustainability, not just that individual appointment while you're on the farm, right then talking to them. They're happy with you when you leave. Sometimes they're not happy with me, but I just hope that we have that trust level that they know, even though with that difficult decision, that we're making big picture the right decision. And I think the veterinarian's role will be that, as the swine industry just gets more and more drilled in to shave a little bit bigger margin. It's not about big picture, what injection do I give to treat that thing? It's how do I make money?
We'll get you out of here on this, Daniel. Is there a hot topic in the industry that you have an opinion to share?
Boy, there's a lot of hot topics. I could talk too long on that. I think if I'm going to share one, it's with African swine fever. We heard about it 5 years ago or more, and it was on everybody's mind. And thankfully, knock on wood, the United States has continued to at least keep it out of commercial swine, active infections as far as we know. And the bad thing about that is it's went long enough that people have kind of got numb to it. It's no less of a threat. It would be no less impactful. It would have just as much or more on exports and everything else. And so I don't want there to be scares like mine to wake us up on that topic, but we can't get complacent. Do not let up. It's more of a threat than ever. And that's not a glamorous topic. It's an old topic, but I feel like, thankfully it isn't on everyone's radar. It's not in this country, but the flip side is we kind of quit talking about it. And so if you're not actively involved in this industry, you might think it's less of a threat, and it is not. So don't let down your guard on that one.
Should there be more pre-planning or just awareness?
Both. I mean, we are aggressively putting plans in place on, secure pork supply and swine health improvement program, all of these programs. And we do the best we can in preparation, but unfortunately, and we even do mock scenarios of, simulated outbreaks. But in reality, we just keep on getting more and more and more prepared, but you won't know. I mean, we can't actually simulate an outbreak, and hopefully we don't have to test it, but all we can do is just continue to constantly try and improve so that we are maximum readiness at that time if it were to occur. So
Dr. Daniel Gascho, thanks for joining us today.
you're welcome. Thank you.